Good evening. I'm Tracy Burns, Deputy Secretary for Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. I'd like to welcome you to this special edition of North Carolina Community Class Edition with Dr. Jelani Favors on HBCUs and Black leadership. As a proud North Carolina HBCU graduate from North Carolina Central University, I can attest to the legacy of our state's historically Black colleges and universities. HBCUs have been central in the fight for education, community development, and civil rights. They have been and are still instrumental in developing young minds and leaders for the challenges to come. At DNCR, we host a summer internship specifically for HBCU students who are rising juniors, seniors, and graduate students. It is a paid 10-week program designed to expose, engage, and educate students by giving them tangible, real-world experience with various divisions within our department. An internship can provide important opportunities for professional development, leadership training, and networking, not to mention the chance to work somewhere like the zoo, an aquarium, or museum. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit our website at www.ncdcr.gov/HBCU internship. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us tonight.
Good evening, everyone. We are so appreciative of Deputy Secretary Tracy Burns, and we want to ask all of you who are joining us here tonight to reach out to HBCU students who could be prospective interns for the department's programs. We really want all of our HBCU students to take advantage of these programs and these internship opportunities. My name is Crystal Regan, and I'm the Education Section Chief here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And we are so appreciative that you have joined us tonight for this special episode of North Carolina Community Class. We've created this series with the goal of educating and engaging all citizens. This is a reoccurring educational series to explore the historical contributions of various groups throughout North Carolina history. We want to make sure we're making connections nationally and internationally. And we want to make sure that we are doing things that are relevant to the social and political issues that continue to impact us to this day. We want to examine these historical issues and events and individuals, and we want to make sure that they are at the forefront of the historical conversations that we are having. We want to encourage learning, conversation, awareness, and understanding. I want to mention that previous tapings of the North Carolina Community Class series can be found on the museum's YouTube page. And I want to talk about a few house rules before we get started with tonight's program. We invite you to get involved in our chat. We want you to participate by commenting and asking questions. And some of those questions we will get to throughout the duration of the program or at the end of the presentation. We're asking that you make sure your questions and comments are relevant to the program tonight and that they are respectful. We will be sharing important information throughout the evening in our chat. I want to make sure I mention a couple of our educators and technicians tonight, tech specialists tonight, Stacy Smith, Michelle Carr, and Joel Rhodes, who have worked hard to make sure that we're bringing a really great program to you tonight. And they will be assisting me with that chat. If you are tweeting about tonight's program, we invite you to use the hashtag NCCommunityClass. NCCommunityClass. We want you to use the hashtag HBCUs and the hashtag North Carolina History. When we do that, we invite people all over our state and our country to get involved in these important conversations. Now on to our speaker. Our keynote tonight is Dr. Jelani Favors. And Jelani Favors is the Henry E. Fry Distinguished Professor of History at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. He has been awarded major fellowships in support of his research that includes an appointment as the Humanities Writ Large Fellow at Duke University in 2013 and was an inaugural recipient of the Mellon HBCU Fellowship at the John Hope Franklin Institute at Duke University in 2009. In 2019, Dr. Favors released his first book entitled Shelter in the Time of Storm: How Black Colleges Foster Generations of Leadership and Activism. And that was published by the University of North Carolina Press. Shelter in the Time of Storm was the recipient of the 2020 Stone Book Award presented annually by the Museum of African American History in Boston, and the 2020 Lillian Smith Book Award given yearly by the Southern Regional Council and the University of Georgia Libraries. It was one of 5 finalists for the 2020 Pauli Murray Book Prize presented by the African American Intellectual History Society. Dr. Favors' research and commentary have appeared in several publications and media outlets, including CNN, C-SPAN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Root, The Chronicle of Higher Education, The Point, and The Conversation. Dr. Favors earned his PhD in history and African American studies from The Ohio State University, and he is a graduate, a proud graduate of North Carolina A&T State University, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in history with honors. Dr. Favors is a native of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. Tonight, Dr. Favors is going to talk about the roots and the histories of North Carolina's HBCUs in particular, but he's going to talk about the importance of the HBCU institution across our nation and make some connections, some relevant connections to the issues that we face today. He's going to talk about how these universities and institutions prepared young Black minds for the challenges that they would face throughout the generations. We invite you to also visit our website to learn more about how you can get a copy of Shelter in the Time of Storm with an autographed signature from Dr. Jelani Favors. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to say that we will turn it over to Dr. Favors in just a moment. He will present to us some really important information. He will have the stage for about 40 minutes, and then we will conclude our program as usual with question and answer, about 20 minutes of question and answer, and some really important announcements at the end. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And now I want to turn it over to Dr. Jelani Favors.
Good evening to everyone. I hope that you can hear me. I hope I'm coming through clear. I want to thank the North Carolina Museum of History for having me this evening. It is an honor to be here. Of course, I would have loved to have this opportunity to be with you in person, to actually deliver this lecture in person in Raleigh, but nevertheless, we are here. And so again, I'm excited to bring you greetings from North Carolina A&T State University. This is home. I am home now. This is my alma mater. I'm literally delivering this lecture from my office that I'm sure probably almost 30 years ago I was getting chewed out from by a professor who was encouraging me to do better in my writing. So it's good to be home. It's kind of a surreal moment for me. But Aggie pride to all the Aggies out there, and HBCU love to all of the HBCU grads. I want to talk with you this evening about HBCUs and Black leadership, reflecting on the radical past, present, and future of North Carolina's Black colleges. As you heard, I'm a 1997 graduate of North Carolina A&T, finished here, and I went off to grad school at Ohio State University. As many of you perhaps already know, here on February 1st, 1960, the sit-ins were launched from this campus, and it provided a massive jolt of energy to the modern civil rights movement. In fact, we just celebrated the 62nd anniversary of that. So when I arrived on campus at Ohio State in 1997, I had no intentions. I did not want to talk about or do research on student activism. But one of my professors, one of my advisors, strongly encouraged me to take another look, to dig deeper. He told me that there was a lot of territory, a lot of ground that had not been covered on the legacy of Black student activism, particularly Black student activism that had emanated out of HBCUs. And so I took him up on that challenge. And one of the first things I did in writing my master's thesis was that I got the opportunity to talk to this gentleman. This, of course, is Ezell Blair Jr. And this is what, during an interview that I did with Jabril, he's now Jabril Kazan, but this was from an interview that I did with him. And this is what he said to me. He says, quote, "They were living a lie and they're thinking that because of our color, we were unintelligent and we knew nothing. But these things were taught to us by the time we were in grade school. Our teachers in the segregated school system told us they were preparing us for the day that we would be free and that we were going to be the leaders of that freedom." This is before Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks came along. This is what I was taught in my school system in Greensboro. So this was a very important moment for me. In fact, as a young graduate student doing work and research, this is a moment where you kind of fall out of your chair. You're like, wait, what did this iconic civil rights leader just tell me? He just told me that before he had ever heard of anybody named Dr. King, before he had ever heard of anybody named Rosa Parks, it was his teachers in these segregated school systems who were really passing the baton of leadership on to him, which sparked, of course, even more energy and even more excitement for myself as a young graduate student. I thought that maybe there was indeed a story that had yet to be told. Of course, the next question was, well, who were these teachers? And why is it that we don't know more about them? Enter this moment where I'm taking a class called The History of Black Education at Ohio State University. And I came across this book, The White Architects of Black Education. It's a classic in the field. It's a great book. But I took exception with some of the arguments that were being made by the author, William H. Watkins. And one passage in particular stood out to me. He said, quote, "Black education invited Blacks to participate in without disrupting the social order. It taught conformity, obedience, sobriety, piety, and the values of enterprise." And immediately I thought to myself, well, if Black education taught and trained Black students to enter into society without disrupting the social order, if it taught them conformity and obedience, then how do we get to this moment? Was indeed this some sort of spontaneous knee-jerk reaction that came out of somewhere? And I thought back to what I had heard from Jabril Kazan, who said that it was his teachers who taught him to become engaged socially and politically within the society. And so I knew that I had my work cut out for me going forward in terms of trying to launch encompassing story of how HBCUs served as seedbeds for activism moving forward. And that's where this story, this book really was launched. The HBCU story collectively does not begin during the Reconstruction era. We love to start in the Reconstruction and the end of slavery, but our story actually begins in the antebellum era, where men like this is Abraham Shadd, who was a Black abolitionist. He served on the Underground Railroad, but there's this color convention, is what they refer to them as, that's going on during the antebellum period, during the 1830s, 1840s. And this is from the 3rd Annual Convention for the Improvement of the Free People of Color, where Abraham Shadd says in 1833, "The most meritorious institution in the vindication of the natural, civil, and political rights of the colored people ought, and we trust does, occupy a distinguished place in the feelings and affections of our people." So again, we're talking about the vindication of the natural, civil, and political rights. There are race riots that are going on in the city of Philadelphia as Abraham Shadd and his colleagues are meeting, as they're convening. In the 1830s and the 1840s, America was an extremely hostile place, both North and South, to the presence of Black people. But yet here's Abraham Shadd saying, look, we need to build institutions that are going to be lasting, that are not just going to give our students an opportunity to educate themselves, but also give them opportunity to vindicate the political rights of Black people in this country. That's 1833. Fast forward the clock 4 years down the road, and we have the birth of the Institute for Colored Youth, which would later go on to become Cheyney State University, is founded in 1837. So I want to talk a little bit about a second curriculum, redefining activism, and a seedbed of activism. Again, HBCUs are founded during this antebellum era. In 1837, you have the founding of the Institute for Colored Youth. In the 1850s, you're going to have the founding of Wilberforce in Ohio, and Lincoln University, also located right outside of Philadelphia. Extremely hostile, extremely violent era in American history to the presence of Black people, particularly again throughout the North and in the South as well. But in the North, as African Americans are escaping to this environment, escaping to this region, they are under attack. And they are looking to build. They're looking to build something that is going to last, something that is going to provide a space and opportunity to train future leaders of the race. Most Black colleges are founded to train teachers or ministers. And why are those professions so vitally important? We know that these are service professions, where again, generations of young African Americans are going to go out into the field, go out into these communities, whether they are in the North or whether they make their way into the Deep South, which again, they'll be extremely hostile to their presence. But yet they will be tasked with a mission, charged with a mission to serve, right? So what we really see going on, and this is a major anchor, intellectual anchor, theoretical anchor in my book, is the development of something known as communitas. Victor Turner, who's a cultural anthropologist, developed this idea and a theory known as communitas. And as is the case when you're doing work and research, a lot of times you begin to sort of give out samples of your work to your colleagues, to your friends who can, give you some advice and some ideas about your writing. And one of my colleagues said, you should really visit the work of Victor Turner, because it sounds like what you're describing is not necessarily a community. This is not brick and mortar. This is a communitas, a racialized space infused with a certain energy that very much produce an opportunity for students to engage in very meaningful social relationships within a closed society. That's what communitas is. And indeed, I found that was a very much an accurate description of what was going on within HBCUs, even going back to the founding of Cheyney State University. You have these closed societies, and by closed societies, we're referring to white America, where African Americans, even in the North, could not purchase property, could not move freely. Many of them were fighting for their lives to remain free. So it's a closed society. So you need institutions where you can feel free, where you can build, where you can engage in and create these freedom dreams for what the future of the race is going to be like. And so HBCUs are going to represent that. And within this space, we begin to see an exchanging, sort of rites of passage, right? So it's not just about our current generation of college students, it's about the next generation and the next generation after them. It's about literally building an educated class of Black people within this country who will embrace their mission, embrace their charge to serve, right? And not only just to serve, but to also serve as cultural, political change agents within society. And that's what HBCUs are doing from the very outset. Again, as I mentioned earlier, space is at a premium. Right? Black churches are being firebombed. Black ministers and Black leaders are being assassinated, often in broad daylight. Even when we have these color conventions going on in the North, people are being treated in a very hostile fashion as they make their way to cities like Buffalo and Syracuse and New York and other places to attend these meetings. So space is at a premium, and Black people understood and realized that if we're going to build something lasting, we have to create a space where, again, the freedom dreams of our students and our youth can run free to a certain extent. And so enter now the energy that's going to become infused within this space. And that energy is what I refer to as a second curriculum. This is a pedagogy of hope. This is about a holistic education, right? This isn't simply about math and science and biology and Latin and Greek and all the other things that they're studying, but Black administrators, right, and Black faculty members understand that there has to be another mission and another purpose inserted into the education of Black students. And so this becomes the major thesis for my book and for my work, is examining something I refer to as the second curriculum. And there are three major ingredients that continue to pop up over time throughout the primary sources that I was consulting to pull this work together. The first one is the idea of race consciousness, which is perhaps one of the most important ingredients. America was an overtly hostile white supremacist country. We cannot get around not talking about that reality. And at the same time, the Chinese state is being founded in the 1830s, minstrel shows are beginning to emerge throughout the North. Minstrel shows which traffic in the idea of white supremacy and promoted the idea that Black people were Sambos and coons and pickaninnies. And these ideas were digested through popular culture throughout the country, right, and embraced as a reality, as a fact. And so HBCUs serve as a space where a counter narrative can indeed be established. And race consciousness becomes a large part of that. And by race consciousness, we mean Black youth being taught that they have a culture, they have a heritage to be proud of, they have a history to be proud of. They're not pickaninnies, they're not coons, they're not inferior, right? They're not inherently inferior, as was not just being embraced and celebrated throughout popular culture, as was also being taught within the academy at large, within predominantly white institutions. These ideas and concepts were being widely embraced. And so HBCUs represent a counter space where a counter narrative can emerge, and race consciousness becomes a very important part of that, right? Idealism is the other component of this second curriculum. And when I refer to idealism, I mean that two words in particular continue to pop up over and over and over again in the primary sources that I consulted for my work, which were largely student newspapers. But these students are being drilled in the concept of democracy and citizenship. Democracy and citizenship. They are literally speeches that visitors to campus are talking about the importance of American democracy and the importance of racial responsibility as these students would leave these institutions to become citizens of the United States of America and continue to work and continue to build. But clearly, one of the things that's most ironic about all of that is that democracy and citizenship were two of the things that Black folks were denied on a daily basis. But yet these students are being drilled in these concepts, and they will become some of the most important outspoken activists around this issue of dealing with the American paradox, dealing with the contradictions of the fact that America professed democracy and citizenship. We're going to get a 14th Amendment. We're going to get a 15th Amendment, which gives African-American men the right to vote. The 14th Amendment, of course, identifies African-Americans as citizens. But all of these things are going to be denied on a daily basis. So how do we deal with that paradox? How do we deal with that contradiction? Black youth were being trained to deal with that within the spaces of HBCUs. And then the third and final component is this sense of cultural nationalism. Right? And by cultural nationalism, we mean that African Americans understood the importance of building up their own, right? Building these institutions, supporting these institutions, doing their best to keep the doors of these institutions open for a future generation. And that produced what I refer to in my work. And of course, I'm not the person who comes up with this term. There are a number of scholars who talked about the growth of race men and race women, right? To be a race man meant that you were proud of your race. You were proud of the Black businesses that occupied your neighborhood, and you made it a particular point to visit and to support those businesses, to support these institutions. And the same thing for race women, right? And so, and in fact, the third chapter of my book deals with Bennett College, talks about the rise of Bennett College, and I entitled that chapter "Race Women" because that's exactly what was being cultivated within these institutions. I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about someone named David Dallas Jones, who makes sure to lift that idea up to an extreme level. What that does, this second curriculum, is that it produces a linked sense of fate. these young African-American students emerging from these institutions will not, and again, we talk about classism, we talk about colorism and elitism, and yes, those were ideas which circulated through these spaces, but there was still a charge to keep. And that charge that many Black students embraced was that they had a mission to serve those who did not have the opportunities to go to college, to serve these communities which had been beset by segregation and racial violence. They embraced that mission. So again, at times I think that we overplay the class cleavages that existed within the Black community. Again, I'm not denying that those did not exist, but these were men and women who were taught to serve, and they embraced that mission moving forward. There's a use of interstitial space, right? And so by that we mean a space within a space, is that even when these institutions had white trustee board members and they were being oversaw by white racist state legislators, right, to make sure that these students are not being inculcated with ideas of radicalism and activism. What happens when a professor, when a teacher closes their door, right? That space becomes theirs, right? What happens when an administrator, after visiting with some of these trustee board members, begins to hire faculty members that he or she knows have an activist background? This is what Black college administrators, many of them were doing. And so using that space to their advantage, they're going to be able, in a very clandestine way, to move forward this mission of not just educating young Black people, but giving them and charging them with a purpose of deconstructing white supremacy wherever they found it. So out of this, right, again, this is the antebellum era, right? Moving into the Reconstruction era, we are going to see a proliferation of HBCUs emerging throughout the state of North Carolina. As I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned this, but North Carolina has more HBCUs than any other state. I know Texas loves to challenge that and include their community colleges as well, but North Carolina has more four-year institutions of higher learning that are HBCUs than any other state in the country. Shaw University, of course, was founded in 1865. It's the first institution in the Deep South, HBCU in the Deep South, to open its doors. Barber Scotia, right outside of Charlotte, founded in 1867. Johnson C. Smith, and I'm just going to go through these: Fayetteville State, St. Aug, Bennett College. Shout out your college if you're on the chat, or if you're on the lecture tonight and you see your college pop up. Winston-Salem State University, the institution where I went to preschool at as a child. Grew up in Winston-Salem. Shout out to Winston-Salem State University, founded in 1892. North Carolina A&T State University, founded the year before that in 1891. Elizabeth City State University, founded in 1891. And of course, you have North Carolina Central University, founded in 1910. But when you look at these dates, right, what stands out is that the majority of these institutions are founded, all of these institutions are founded as Jim Crow is becoming crystallized, as white terrorism has become normalized, right? Rayford Logan, the historian at Howard University, referred to this as the nadir of race relations. Moving out of Reconstruction, which ends in 1877, it became normal to butcher African-American men and women and children in the streets in terms of racial violence. Lynching is at an all-time high. Again, Black churches are being firebombed. Black towns are under duress. Many of them, of course, folks know the examples of places like Rosewood, but this idea of how do we build, how do we sustain, right? It's going to be these institutions that light the path forward for how Black folks can use the levers of upward mobility for an entire class of uneducated people, but also to, again, equip them with the intellectual tools to articulate for a call to white supremacy and a call to Jim Crow. And these are the type of race men and race women who are circulating throughout this environment, right? You have Anna Julia Cooper, who's a student at St. Aug, Of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her, one of the first Black feminist works in America, A Voice from the South, very powerful read. James D. Carruthers comes down and becomes a student at Bennett College. For those who are unaware, Bennett College was not always a single-sex institution. It did not become a single-sex institution until 1926. So Carruthers comes down and he's a student at Bennett College. Right? He was often referred to by T. Thomas Fortune, a leader of the Negro Business League, as the future poet of the race. Right? And he comes down and he actually gets to Bennett and becomes involved in a protest against segregated trains. As he was coming back, he and his peers were coming back from High Point, North Carolina. They're kicked off a train for protesting segregation and have to end up walking their way back to Bennett College. So again, these are young men and women who are being tasked with and embracing a mission to use their voices, to use their talents, to speak out. Right, to demand first-class citizenship, to deal with that paradox of democracy and citizenship and how it was denied to Black people on a daily basis. This is what the HBCUs in North Carolina are ultimately doing during this environment of hostility during the nadir. Here you see an image of the women of Bennett College relaxing on campus. And again, this is something that Black folks in the Deep South often did not have the opportunity to do, simply just to be free, right? To be themselves, right? To again, let their freedom dreams run unimpeded, right? To think about the future of the race, to enjoy themselves, to be unapologetically Black. And that's what HBCUs have often represented, a space where again, Black youth could be free, but they also felt the weight of this mission to become involved in, again, deconstructing Jim Crow and white supremacy wherever they found it. Let's talk a little bit more about how that mission begins to further unfold within these on these college campuses. This is Ella Baker, a 1927 graduate of Shaw University, is often considered one of the mothers of the modern civil rights movement, certainly played a critical role in helping the launch of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But in Barbara Ransby's book, her classic study on Ella Baker, biography entitled Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision, she talks about the mission of service that was played. Ella Baker says, it was at Shaw University that I learned the importance of giving back. From that book, it says, quote, the school de-emphasized individualism and stressed community service, and Christian charity instead. Where I went to school, you went there to give the best of yourself to other people, rather than to extract from other people for your own benefit. As I said before, yes, classism, elitism is a part of the legacy of not just HBCUs, but higher education at large. But what we clearly see is that there are generations of young Black people who move through these institutions, who go out to serve as teachers, as activists, as Ella Baker would become, as ministers, right? And so they're embracing this charge to extend themselves to those who might not have had that same opportunity that they did. As I mentioned before, the second curriculum is thriving within these institutions, and race consciousness is a large part of that. The archives, the F.D. Bluford Archives Library, which I literally are right across the street from where I'm sitting right now on the campus of A&T, just published this photo the other day. Carter G. Woodson, if you're not familiar with that name, Dr. Carter G. Woodson becomes the founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Ultimately, they put forth this idea of establishing a Negro History Week, which later goes on to become Black History Month. So Carter G. Woodson is often celebrated as the father of Black History Month. And one of the most important things about HBCUs and spaces is people like Carter G. Woodson are circulating through these institutions on a monthly basis, right? Carter G. Woodson, here he is, the commencement speaker at A&T in 1932. He's at Prairie View A&M. He's going down to Florida A&M. He's going to Fisk. He's going to Howard. So again, building that network of other instructors and professors who embrace his charge to teach and embrace African-American history, this illustrates how race consciousness becomes a very important seed, an ingredient of this second curriculum. The type of people who are circulating through here, the lecture circuit that existed at HBCUs illustrates the type of people that these folks are being exposed to, again, on a daily basis at HBCUs. In her biography on Ella Baker talked about the fact, Barbara Ransby documented the fact that Max Yergin was one of her favorite visitors to campus. Max Yergin, who had ties to radical socialist beliefs, but here he is on campus showing up at Shaw University, where his wife was a graduate and where she worked, right? Charging the students, embracing them, but also giving them the mission to use their talents, to use their gifts, to become engaged in a sense of activism. Again, we talked about the importance of the Association for Negro Life and History. This is Dr. Omar T Gibbs. This is his certificate of membership to the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Note the date, 1941. If that name sounds familiar to you, I'm literally sitting in a building entitled Gibbs Hall at North Carolina A&T State University, but Dr. Omar T Gibbs becomes the president at North Carolina A&T during the sit-ins, right before the sit-ins, and throughout the sit-ins until he's forced into retirement. So what does it mean when you see administrators? He was a dean of the arts and sciences, had a degree in history himself, was one of the first African Americans to be commissioned to serve in World War I. What does it mean when Black students can rub shoulders with people like this on their campuses? What does it mean when they're a part of this type of environment, this charged with this energy of race consciousness and idealism and cultural nationalism? It means that at some point, right, we're going to begin to see overt protests emerging out of these institutions. And that's a very dangerous thing in the 1940s and 1930s to see that throughout the Deep South. But Black students are going to begin to find their voices and use those voices to once again call for an end to bigotry and racism within this country. David Dallas Jones, and this is taken apart from my book, Shelter in a Time of Storm. But here's Dr. David Dallas Jones, who served as the president of Bennett College from 1927 to 1955. And I write in the book, it says, quote, and this of course is highlighting the student boycott. Students are going to boycott a theater in 1937 in downtown Greensboro. And so this portion of the text illustrates that. It says, quote, the flashpoint arrived when the Southern Theaters Incorporated announced its new policy to censor Black dignity, cutting scenes from films wherever Blacks and whites were portrayed as equals. News announcing the theater company's decision spread quickly among both the Bells and the students attending the larger North Carolina Agricultural Technical State College, located directly across the street from Bennett. The Carolina Times, a newspaper serving citizens across the state, reported that 1,000 students joined in the boycott. It also reported that the North Carolina Interracial Committee had also registered a stern protest with Southern Theaters Incorporated, a move that showed David Dallas Jones working behind the scenes. David Dallas Jones was a member of the Interracial Committee, which had chapters all across the South, as well as chapters in the Midwest and the North. But again, David Dallas Jones is a race man. He's a race man. He's an alumnus of Bennett College, right? And so he's a race man. He comes back and he's embracing this sense of cultural nationalism. He's embracing this sense of race consciousness. He's exposing his students to idealism, and that matters. These students explode on the scene, rejecting the principles of white supremacy that they find within the actions of the local theaters here in Greensboro. And again, we see these seeds of activism being planted through this second curriculum. Another beautiful example of that and this is once again at Bennett College. Bennett College women using the student newspaper, the Bennett Banner, and the radio to take on Jim Crow. So again, within this interstitialized space, right, we begin to see, interstitial space rather, we begin to see Black students using their voices, right, to call for an end to racism within America. And if that space means writing editorials in the newspaper, they're going to do that. If that space means taking to the radio airwaves in the 1940s, they're going to do that. Imagine Black women, right, coming on the airwaves in the 1940s in a very radical way to embrace again, race consciousness as an important ingredient of the second curriculum. I'm going to share with you a passage from the book which illustrates and highlights that very point. The women of Bennett regularly packed their 15-minute show full of inspiration with the hopes to establish a counter-narrative that commended the contributions of African Americans to daily life in America. A transcript from one show, apprising their audience of the importance of Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week, reads, quote, Mr. Woodson felt the colored group here in America needed something for its own internal racial growth. They thought that as people learned more about the achievements of the Negro, this will help destroy some of the misconceptions about his native ability, which seem to exist even among Negroes. They hoped that learning about the Negro, both in the past and present, would prove an inspiration to colored people everywhere. The Bennett students in charge of the program, Carolyn Lynn Booker, Cassandra Moore, proceeded to discuss a course at Bennett titled Negro History that was offered at Bennett by Francis Johnson, that was offered at Bennett and taught at Bennett by Francis Johnson. And they also acquainted the audience with the resources that were available through the campus library. The radio program also provided a platform for the further construction of Black womanhood. Radio was then, as it still is largely today, a male-dominated industry that provided little room for female voices or on-air personalities. It was highly unusual for women in the 1930s and 1940s to write their own scripts and produce their own show, but Bennett students shattered whatever notions the listening public had about who should be given on-air publicity or what topics should be broached. On one broadcast, a segment entitled Great Names in History featured all African-American women who had served as powerful change agents in American history. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Phyllis Wheatley, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Marian Anderson. Their Negro history class instructor for that semester, John Hope Franklin, must have surely been proud of his students. Just 2 years after witnessing his students promote African-American history on the Greensboro airwaves, he finished a manuscript that would become a seminal contribution to the field entitled From Slavery to Freedom, A History of Negro America, which I'm sure many of you probably have a copy of that book, which was taught and used as the seminal text, African-American history text for many years in this country. So again, what does it mean when your teacher is John Hope Franklin, right? What does it mean when you look up in 1951 and John Hope Franklin is on the campus of Morgan State University talking about integration, right, for History Week? So the students in Morgan State, so it's not just in North Carolina, but across the board, you see HBCUs cultivating this type of environment, creating this type of space where, again, the freedom dreams of Black folks can indeed run free, right? In 1942, you have students at Southern University using the pages of their student newspaper and the celebration of the fact that they're graduating in 1942 to embrace the Double V campaign. The Double V campaign stood for double victory in World War II. These are African Americans saying, look, we're going to go and fight. We're going to defeat the Nazis. We're going to defeat the Japanese Empire. But when we come home, we are determined to fight and end the evils of Jim Crow and segregation and white supremacy in America as well. And here you see students at Southern University using these pages to illustrate this exact thing, right? Again, the space matters. The people that you are inviting into this space. Here you see an image of Dr. Ralph Bunche. Dr. Ralph Bunche, of course, was the first African American to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He played a critical role as an ambassador to the United Nations, but he also taught at Howard University, right? That matters. Right, he went on to, of course, become a co-partner in the production of Gunnar Myrdal's book entitled An American Dilemma, which examined the legacy of Jim Crow and race in America. And here he is on the campus at North Carolina State University, where he spoke to students. Right? So again, when you create that type of environment and space and invite these type of people in to this environment, they're charging that atmosphere, right? Absolutely charging the atmosphere. And so it's no surprise when we fast forward to 1955 and we have this incident, which occurs on campus at A&T, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. But in 1955, During Founders Day, Governor William Hodges is on campus at A&T to address the students. And he is continuing to slip up somehow on the word Negro. And he's mispronouncing that word to the point where it sounds a lot like the other word. And he begins to, there's some shuffling of the feet, and ultimately students at A&T are booing the governor in 1955. And this is from the A&T Register, the student newspaper here at A&T, documenting that incident. It says, quote, "The incident which occurred during our recent Founders Day exercise has been the subject of many discussions on the campus and elsewhere. The interruption of Governor Hodges' discourse cannot be truly called spontaneous. On the other hand, it did not come of formal planning. Most of the people present had heard or were unaware or were aware of the context and presentation of Governor Hodges' speech this summer on voluntary segregation. They didn't like it. Therefore, the murmur which arose during the governor's speech was prompted not only by his ideas and pronunciation, but by a sum of other things as well. Unfortunately, the governor threw gasoline on smoldering embers." And the emphasis here is on smoldering embers, right? This campus was already smoldering. HBCUs were already smoldering, right? Looking and waiting for a moment to continue to use their voices to, again, deconstruct white supremacy and Jim Crow wherever they could find it. So fast forward, 1 month later, we turn to Alabama now, right? And in December of 1955, it's there that we begin to see, once again, HBCUs using their voices, using the talent of their students to call for an end to segregation, to call for an end to racial hatred in America. This is a political satire from the Freshmore from 1955. And what do we see? We see students using their artistic talents to illustrate the fact that, hey, there's a change of the seasons. It's December, right? Basketball season's coming in, football season's going out. But they use that symbolically to say, you know what else is coming in and what's going out? Equal rights are coming in. First-class citizenship is coming in. Right? Hatred and segregation, prejudice, they're on their way out, right? And integration is the goal, right? Why is all this important when you have people like Joanne Robinson, who wasn't just an English professor at Alabama State University, but also was a part of the Women's Political Council, which was comprised of a number of women who were faculty at Alabama State University, who were good friends with Rosa Parks, right? Who said, look, when she's arrested, that enough is enough, right? We refuse to be subjected to this type of hatred, to this type of intolerance anymore. And Joanne Robinson helps to infuse that energy within spaces like Alabama State University. Again, why is that important? Why does the space matter, right? Loretta Jean Thomas, a freshman at Alabama State University, writes this article in 1955 entitled, "Is White Supremacy Faltering?" Again, this is Alabama in 1955. And here you see a freshman student using her voice, the power of her pen, to raise the question. And it's not rhetorical. She answers it at the end of the article. She says, yes, white supremacy is faltering. In that same year, the Montgomery bus boycott is going to take off. Again, why is all this important? Take a note to who the faculty advisor is to the student newspaper. It's Miss Joanne Robinson. So the relationship that these students are building with these Black faculty members are critically important in seasoning the atmosphere of these institutions. It is no shock and no surprise of what happens on February 1st, 1960 on this campus that I'm speaking to you from. Right? The sit-ins were not a knee-jerk reaction. They were part of generations of young Black people being trained to use their voices to call for a better America. And that continues even through the Black Power movement. When you look at HBCUs in the Black Power movement, what do we see? We see Black colleges under attack. Stop me where you've heard this before, right? As we sit here today in 2022, HBCUs are once again receiving threats of racial violence. And of course, once HBCUs have exploded onto the scene in the 1960s and direct action becomes a norm throughout the modern civil rights movement, HBCUs are identified as the source for that energy, right? HBCUs are going to become a lot more targeted by a number of people. Of course, at South Carolina State University, just 2 days ago, We recognize the anniversary of what's referred to as the Orangeburg Massacre, where forces of the state, racist forces of the state of South Carolina, executed and assassinated 3 young men on that campus in 1968. Again, in 1969, tanks literally rolled up the streets of this campus from the National Guard, and 1 student is going to be killed on this campus in 1969. At Jackson State University in 1970, students are killed. At Southern University in 1972, students are killed. So again, HBCUs are very much alive and well during the Black Power movement, and they're using their voices to articulate for a new type of transformation and change within America, which is more bold, which is more determined than what we saw from previous generations, from previous calls that existed within the modern civil rights movement. So HBCUs are indeed centers of Black power throughout America. And this is something which we don't often talk about. We often we talk about the modern civil rights movement and in the early 1960s, but we often skip over the fact that HBCUs are just as central to the rise of the Black Power movement as they had been to other political movements. On this campus, we see the creation of the Student Organization for Black Unity, as well as the Greensboro Association of Poor People. Again, both organizations intended to reach out to the Black community, to reinvigorate the spirit of student activism after the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had gone defunct towards the late 1960s. So again, HBCUs are providing a vital space where this type of energy can be generated. Malcolm X Liberation University, right, begins with students from Duke University saying that they want transformation and change on that campus. Students from North Carolina Central become heavily involved, but ultimately Howard Fuller makes the decision to transfer and relocate that institution to Greensboro, to be closer to the activist energies that are circulating within Greensboro and on this campus, because A&T was a major player within the movement. North Carolina Central was also a major player. I'm not trying to create that fight tonight between North Carolina Central and North Carolina A&T, but Howard Fuller says, look, I'm going to go to Greensboro to be closer to what's going on that campus and the energy that's emerging from that campus. The Institute of the Black World is founded, which becomes a major Black think tank during that era. It's founded on the campus of what we refer to now as the AUC, the Atlanta University Center, with Spelman, Morehouse, Clark, and Morris Brown. And of course, there's also going to be another campaign, the National Save and Change Black Schools campaign, where you begin to see African-American students in the spirit of cultural nationalism saying, look, there's a lot wrong on these campuses. There's a lot that's not being done on these campuses, but we don't need to do away with them. We need to build them up. We need to save them, but also change them. That becomes a major plank within the Black Power movement as it relates to student activism during the Black Power era. Again, you see students from North Carolina Central University marching in solidarity with the students from South Carolina State University who were killed in 1968 in what's referred to as the Orangeburg Massacre. So you see, again, students using their voices to demand transformation and change. Here's another great example. This is one of the best examples and illustrations of how vibrant the Black Power era was, particularly on a campus like A&T. When you looked at this newspaper, this front page of the A&T Register, I mean, it just is overflowing with news from this moment in history, from this crossroads in history. You see Nelson Johnson, who of course also was and is an Aggie and played a critical role in the launching of both SOBU as well as the Greensboro Association of Poor People. You see that he's become elected as the SOBU national leader. You see Malcolm X University opens to liberate Black people. You see the infusion and the elevation of Black politicians, which also became a outgrowth of the Black Power era. More and more Black politicians being elected to office. Here you see Barbara elected to city council. And then you see at the bottom, Africa has experienced a number of golden ages. Yet again, you see race consciousness overflowing from the pages of Black student newspapers, illustrating the second curriculum was alive and well during the Black Power era. And here you see, again, on campus at A&T in 1973, you see HBCUs coming together. Earl Picard, right, who was the SGA president at Southern University. You see Lewis Dowdy. You see administrators are standing right there standing in the gaps. Lewis Dowdy might not have his Black Power fist up, but he's there. He's there to address the students and embrace this idea of saving and changing Black schools in the name of cultural nationalism. And then you see Marilyn Marshall there as well. And of course, you also see Nelson Johnson. I want to talk about, as I close, I want to talk about the legacy of these institutions and what really powered the second curriculum. And the spirit tip of that movement was rooted within the humanities and social sciences on these campuses. Again, what these students were being taught mattered. It matters when Carter G. Woodson is on campus, when W.E.B. Du Bois is on campus, when Mary McLeod Bethune is coming through your institution, and the type of courses that are being taught within these spaces. It fuels their freedom dreams. It fuels the second curriculum, right? And again, the courses that were often taught were rooted in the humanities and in the social sciences. And one of the things that I find disconcerting about HBCUs and higher education in general is that we've de-emphasized the humanities and social sciences moving forward. And this graph taken from my book really sort of illustrates that. When you follow that graph, and of course the blue line, the dark blue line at the bottom of this graph, you see the humanities has really sort of remained on a flat line since the mid-1960s up through the 21st century. And education training has had a precipitous drop off as well. As I said before, HBCUs are founded to train teachers and to train ministers. And here education is taking a major hit, but social sciences and the humanities were the heartbeat of this intellectual growth of the second curriculum, which powered much of the activism that we saw emerging from these campuses. But yet we've seen a steady decline in that. And one can also make a conclusion that with that decline, have we indeed seen a development, observed the development where HBCUs are no longer the type of seedbeds of activism that they once were? So as I close, I leave you with this. Are HBCUs still relevant spaces where activism can be generated? Do they still accept that charge, that historical mission to not just produce students who are going to assume places in corporate America, to not just embrace a curriculum rooted in STEM, but do they indeed embrace this charge to create and cultivate an environment which will empower their students to become powerful social and political change agents, equipped with the intellectual talent to identify and to deconstruct white supremacy and hostility and racism and bigotry wherever they find it? I think that's a question for all of us to ponder. How are student activists addressing internal issues that we see circulating on these campuses? One, historic inequities and preserving HBCUs. I've been very happy and emboldened by the fact that we're beginning to see some conversation on this, about the historic inequities, which have been very much created by a deliberate and systemic effort to cripple these institutions from their very founding. And so, you know, whether it's looking at what happened in Maryland, I think there's some conversation that's occurring now in Tennessee. We saw in the Ayers case several years back in Mississippi, there needs to be some form of restitution. And hopefully students within these institutions will continue to put pressure on the powers that be to make that right. All right. Secondly, rape culture, not just at HBCUs, but within a higher education in general. We see issues such as paternalism and misogyny still present on these campuses. And we need to have the boldness and the courage to call this out. And to, more importantly, not just call it out, but to transform and make these spaces safer for women on these campuses. LGBTQ issues. We know that this is a subject which still produces a lot of taboo feelings within the Black community. But we have to have honest conversations about the type of spaces that we're crafting and creating, again, to make sure that they're welcoming for all of our students. And again, I think that what we see here is a spirit of save and change, right? Is that clearly, in the spirit of cultural nationalism, HBCUs matter. But at the same time, we have to have the boldness and the conviction to say that we have to find ways to continue to transform them, to change them, to help them evolve. How are student activists addressing external issues? such as voter suppression. Again, I'm very emboldened and happy to see in this image where we see students from A&T protesting voter suppression in 2019. We know that this is an issue literally exploding across the political landscape of this country. What are HBCU students going to have to say about that? Gentrification and underdevelopment, prison and bail reform, environmental racism. There's a plethora of issues that deserve our attention if indeed we're going to continue to build what Dr. King referred to as his beloved community. In the same way in which Dr. King first found that mission and found that purpose as a student at Morehouse College, we need to continue to create the type of spaces which will produce the Dr. Kings, the Ella Bakers, the Diane Nashes, the John Lewises, the Stokely Carmichaels of a new generation. And my hope and my prayer is that HBCUs will continue to do that. Thank you so much for your time. At this point, I'll end here and open it up to any questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Favors. This was awesome. What we're going to do now is we're going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes to answer some of the questions. I've received questions in email and through the chat regarding Dr. Favors' presentation. And Jelani, what I will do is I think we're going to do a reverse chronological sort of question and answer session, because so many people are asking about HBCUs in terms of preservation. Mm-hmm. How are we going to preserve these institutions, particularly, and I want to wrap this up with another question regarding the bomb threats to HBCUs within the past month. We've had several people who've asked questions about what triggered these recent bomb threats. Was it related to athletic decisions? I'm thinking about Jackson State and Coach Prime, and I'm sure you're following that, and the decisions of young athletes who want to connect to HBCUs and the concerns about what that means financially for some predominantly white institutions, and what that just means for HBCUs in general. And I'm pulling all of that together because I think there's a lot of interconnectedness. Sure. But I'd like for you to unpack that, break that apart, and talk a little bit about what is concerning people immediately, which is this issue of HBCU bomb threats and athleticism, particularly with basketball and football, and what that means for our future. So just talk about that, if you will.
Sure, absolutely. I've given several interviews this past week with a number of media outlets who are interested in these bomb threats. One of the things that I point out is that while first of all, HBCUs were born again, for the most part, within a cauldron of violence, right? Yeah. The Reconstruction Era. Again, even prior to this, in the antebellum era, there was always this sort of hostility toward the idea of creating any form of Black institution that would favor Black people, that would help Black people. And so there's a historic trajectory there. There's a historical element to that HBCUs are intimately familiar with. We know what that means to be targeted. Black institutions in general know what that means to be targeted through forces of violence and hatred. That's not new to us. Right. But what we're also seeing is, and I'm proud to say this, and I think that it should be said, is that there is a modicum of a renaissance around HBCUs right now. We do see HBCUs dominating, I shouldn't say dominating, but they're having a share of the platform in terms of highlighting what it is that they do well, right? So whether that's Beyonce dedicating a love letter to Black colleges through her Netflix special that she did, or whether that's celebrating the fact that these institutions are producing people like Vice President Kamala Harris and Senator Raphael Warnock or Michael Regan, right? Or Keisha Lance Bottoms. HBCUs are still paving the way in producing leaders for this country. And also, I think they have entered into the chat, if you will, in terms of making it play for as you mentioned, athletes in all sports. There are a number of people who are, let's be very honest, are coming home.
Yes.
Before integration, HBCUs garnered all of the Black athletic talent. And now, due to a lot of the resurgence in racial hostilities, in violence, in bigotry in this country that we're seeing, there are a number of students and student athletes who are saying, and families of those children, of those youth, who are saying, look, I want my student, I want my young person to attend a space where they can be unapologetically Black, where
Yes.
they will not simply be championed because of what they are doing on the field of play, but also for what they're doing off the field of play. And I think there are a number of people who are saying, look, let's not look to HBCUs as an alternative. Let's look to HBCUs as a first choice.
As a first choice, yes.
As a first choice, and where we're sending our young people. And yes, that is garnering a lot of attention. And anytime these type of institutions are garnering that type of attention, it's also going to garner hatred. And I think this is what we've seen, is that as HBCUs enter into the public light more and more, that we're seeing people who are resenting that. But we continue in our charge, we continue in our mission, and our doors are always open. And we're not going to cower. We're not going to be afraid to those who would do our institutions harm. Again, we've seen this before. These institutions will continue to thrive and remain, and they'll continue to be shelters in a time of storm.
Shelter through the time of storm. And I want to say, as growing up in Eastern North Carolina, in a Christian church, we've heard that hymn many times, right?
Absolutely.
He's a battle axe.
Yeah.
In the time of the storm, shelter in the time of the storm.
My mom is probably on the chat, so I got to tell you, I'm a preacher. And so that's actually where the title of the book came from.
Yes,
Remembering hearing that. And I said that represents so perfectly what these institutions have represented. They are indeed shelters in a time of storm, and they're shelters that have mattered and meant something to Black people in this country. And they have made an indelible impact on the social, political, and economic cultures of this country. And they still do. Still do.
So I wanted to make sure I put out there that came out of a hymn. Right.
Absolutely.
Came out of a hymn that many of us, particularly in the South and the Christian churches in the South, are familiar with. So thank you for that. The next question is also a contemporary question. In terms of the Black Power movement, you mentioned Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and you talked about the Black Power movement, particularly in the 60s. I want you to talk about what white supremacy means in contemporary terms. What are the remnants that people like Stokely Carmichael and others have left for people who are interested in maintaining HBCUs? What is left for them to clean up, if you will? What is left, Jelani, for them to pay attention to in terms of the struggles that HBCUs have to maintain their autonomy, to maintain their cultural presence, to maintain their power in 2022?
Well, I'm part of the History and Political Science department at A&T. That's a fairly new development. Joining those two departments together. As I often tell my students, I was this close to double majoring in poli-sci because I love that field so much. But in political science, they use a term called dog whistle politics.
Right.
And I don't think what we're seeing now in terms of the current political culture, it doesn't even constitute dog whistle politics. They're just open, raw, naked appeals to hatred and bigotry that are going on right now within our political discourse. And it's unfortunate. But what it clearly illustrates is that those same fights that Kwame Ture and Stokely Carmichael had, those same fights that Ella Baker and David Dallas Jones had, those same fights that people like Fannie Jackson Cochran, I'm going all the way back, to the founder of these institutions, Octavius Catto. Octavius Catto, by the way, and I lead my book off with this story, and this is not North Carolina, but this is the Institute for Colored Youth. Octavius Catto was a professor. He was both an alumnus and a professor at the Institute for Colored Youth, which would later go on to become Cheney State University, but he becomes a major activist in Philadelphia, and he's assassinated in the streets of Philadelphia by a bigot who was upset that the Institute for Colored Youth had played a critical role in championing the 15th Amendment, which gave African-American men the right to vote. And so again, that same system, the essence of that bigotry and that hatred that was present when Octavius Catto was assassinated in the streets in 1872 in Philadelphia, unfortunately, we still see it with us, Crystal. And I think that means that we need HBCUs now more than ever. And when we look at, again, our political discourse, we see voter suppression very much alive and well. We see gerrymandering. We see people saying that, hey, we don't want to talk about history. We don't want to have open, honest conversations about our past. Again, these are all issues that have haunted us since the very beginning of this country. Literally, I delivered a lecture in my African-American history class the other day talking about the William Dunning School of Thought. And for those who don't know William Dunning, William Dunning was a professor at Columbia University who said, look, I'm going to train an entire army of young students who are going to go out and produce literature and scholarship and research, which says that Reconstruction was a horrible mistake, and that we should have never given Black folks political rights. We should have never made them citizens. And these things are taught in American school systems for years and years to come. These things are going to be taught in American history textbooks. And so now, fast forward to 2022, people saying, hey, we don't want to have honest conversations about our past. That means that the work of HBCUs, the work of, I'll just be quite honest, the work of freedom-loving people in this country, people who are in pursuit of justice and a more fairer country for all people, our work continues. And that's a hard pill for us to swallow, but it's the reality. It's the charge that I'm happy to be back home in my institution, but this is the mission and the purpose that I'm passing on to my students. And many of them are, many of them were really just blown away. We just started the semester at A&T, and many of them are saying, Dr. Favors, I've never heard of this history. I don't know about what it is that you're talking about. And they're angry by it. Why is it that we're not taught this past? Why is it that we don't understand its correlation and connection to contemporary issues? And again, that means our work is still very much cut out for us. Very much.
And I think, Dr. Favors, you're speaking to educators across the board. This isn't an HBCU thing. This isn't an academic higher education thing. I think this is about educators across the board throughout our public schools, our private schools, and our charter schools. And the challenge we have to make sure that we're being vocal about making sure we're giving all of our young people the appropriate education, the appropriate civic and history education that they need to be productive citizens as we move forward as a hopeful democracy. I think everybody knows, those of us who study political science and history know that democracy is the goal. It is not the reality, right? It is the goal, and that we're operating as a republic, and that we're moving towards democracy. So thank you for that. The next question that I've had is, can you talk a little bit more about the antebellum components of HBCUs? I think most people know about HBCUs in terms of Jim Crow. They know about HBCUs in terms of post-Reconstruction or during Reconstruction, but very few, I think, understand that HBCUs in terms of as an educational proponent across the nation, and particularly the Deep South, were undergirded and being prepared prior to the Civil War. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, and I thank you for that question. That's a really great question, and you're right. Too often it's overlooked, whether it's through documentaries or other folks who have who have taken on the challenge of telling our stories, we often start during the Reconstruction era, and that ignores what I often refer to as the triumvirate of HBCUs that existed prior to that, which of course were beginning with the Institute for Colored Youth in 1837, with Lincoln University, founded in 1854, I believe, and then you have Wilberforce, founded in 1856. And all three of them, ironically, love to go back and forth with each other about who's the first HBCU. It's a funny debate, because the Institute for Colored Youth was founded in 1837, but Lincoln University comes along and says, well, we're the first institution to actually give degrees, right? And so that makes us the first HBCU. And then Wilberforce says, well, we were actually founded by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, so we're the first institution founded by Black folks, so that makes us the first HBCU. But nevertheless, again, what do these institutions represent? They represent shelters in a time of storm. When you look at the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, Black folks are striving to remain free. We've often done ourselves a disservice by painting a picture of the North as some sort of paradise. You know, Black folks were being heavily discriminated against. As I said before, there were race riots in the city of Philadelphia in the 1830s and 1840s. There were people who resented the Black presence within these northern cities, and were doing their best to try to eliminate them as economic competitors. They didn't want to see an educated class of Black folks emerging, or Black folks in general emerging and competing for some of the jobs that were emerging during the Industrial Revolution. And so, but there's a need to create this type of space. And that's what Black folks began to take up. Again, you have these color conventions that are going on. And in every last one of these color conventions, you see these leaders saying that, hey, we need institutions that are going to train and educate our young people to use their talents to speak out. Again, I mentioned people like Octavius Catto at the Institute for Colored Youth, Jacob White Jr., who's at the Institute for Colored Youth, Ebenezer Bassett, who is the first Black principal of the Institute for Colored Youth. When John Brown, some of you may know that name, when John Brown is found at Harper's Ferry, he has a note in his pocket, and on that note he has a list of people that he wanted someone to get in contact with if he needed help. Ebenezer Bassett. Ebenezer Bassett's name is on that, and the address of the Institute for Colored Youth is on that note. And which scared Ebenezer Bassett. He said, oh, they're going to trace this back to me. But it shows you the type of energies and activism that were circulating within these institutions. Petitions are being created to lobby for the 14th Amendment, to lobby for the 15th Amendment. And this is prior to the Civil War even beginning, right? So from the very outset, the die is cast. We understand that these institutions are going to be set apart. Right? They are not like Harvard. They are not like Yale. They are not like Johns Hopkins, where students are at those institutions studying and embracing the fact that Black people are inherently inferior. That's what they're being taught at those institutions. White supremacy is thriving at those institutions. But within these early fledgling HBCUs in the antebellum era, we see the counter narrative. We see the second curriculum. And that separates these institutions from the outset. On a very distinct path, which is going to embrace democracy and citizenship for all, which is going to embrace building a more tolerant society, which is going to embrace the charge and the purpose and the mission of equipping their students with the type of intellectual talents and skills to make America a better place for all people. And again, to me, this is why HBCUs matter. This is why history is so critically important. It's the culture pageantry is beautiful. The bands are beautiful. The step shows are beautiful. You know, we love to talk about Black boy joy and Black girl magic thriving within these spaces, and they do. But let's be very clear, the most important distinction that HBCUs have ever made are transforming the political landscape of this country to bring us closer to democracy. And that's something that many of the PWIs cannot hang their hat on. Many of them have upheld the concepts and ideals of white supremacy, while HBCUs have used these spaces to tear them down. And that makes us different. And that begins in the antebellum era, and it moves forward to this very day.
Dr. Favors, thank you so much. I think that's a beautiful summary because I think it speaks to how HBCUs have been the conscience of America, the conscience of what we call democracy and what we say we want to be as a nation.
Yes.
And I think that's so important. And so we've run out of time, but definitely not out of content. I want to hold this up. I want to ask you all, those of you who are still with us tonight, to look at Dr. Jelani Favors' work, Shelter in the Time of Storm, Black Leadership and Black Activism and HBCUs. And I think he's done an excellent job tonight of pulling together what HBCUs mean to Black folks in terms of community, in terms of politics. And he's also talked about what HBCUs have meant to our democracy and our country. And we're still on that trajectory. And we want to continue to follow this, support HBCUs. I would also ask that you look to the North Carolina Museum of History for continued programming that feeds into this narrative of the work that African Americans have put in place from colonial times, from the beginning, in the foundation of this state and this nation. And Dr. Favors, we appreciate you. What we will do is, you have said, and I'm putting you on the spot here, you've said that you would be open to coming to the Museum of History for a book signing and some conversation. And we're going to hold you to that. And love to have you here at the museum in order to do that. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We want to ask that you look at the Museum of History for continued Black History programs throughout the month. Also, we will have some North Carolina community class programs in March for women's history. And we'll have a slew of programs prepared in the fall and in the spring. And I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Jelani Favors. I want to give a shout out to all of the HBCUs who have joined us here tonight. We are going to edit this video, put it on our YouTube page. Please share once we upload it. Once we upload that page, and share with your networks. And again, we just want to thank you for joining us tonight. Please be safe, stay conscious, stay aware, and continue to study our history. Good night.
Thank you so much. Take care.